In the glittering world of high society, sometimes a single moment can change everything. When Elaine Hackman walked into one of New York's most prestigious charity galas, she had no idea she was about to become the target of Manhattan's most notorious socialite. A simple misunderstanding would spiral into public humiliation, but the tables were about to turn in the most unexpected way. Comment where you're watching from today, because this story of privilege, prejudice, and a powerful comeback is one you won't forget. The annual Hope Foundation Charity Gala was the crown jewel of New York's social calendar, a night where the elite gathered not just to be seen, but to outshine one another in displays of wealth and generosity. The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into a breathtaking wonderland of crystal chandeliers and white orchids, with champagne flowing as freely as the conversations about summer homes and stock portfolios. At these events, your name was your currency, and the Vanderbilts and Astors of today's society ruled with the same iron grip as their predecessors, though now their power came wrapped in designer gowns and filtered through social media influence. Among them moved Diana Whitcomb, the undisputed queen of Manhattan's upper echelon. At 45, Diana had perfected the art of aging gracefully while maintaining her grip on society's steering wheel. Her family's banking fortune had opened doors, but it was her razor-sharp wit and even sharper elbows that had kept her at the top. Tonight, she was resplendent in a custom Valentino gown that cost more than most people's cars, her diamond necklace catching the light with every calculated turn of her head. "Darling, you've outdone yourself," cooed a fellow socialite, air-kissing Diana's cheeks. "I heard you donated $500,000 before the event even began." Diana smiled, her perfectly whitened teeth gleaming. "Well, one must set the standard, mustn't one? These new money types need to understand that generosity is an art form." Across the room, moving with a quiet grace that seemed at odds with the performative elegance around her, was Elaine Hackman. At 32, she possessed a natural beauty that required little enhancement. Her simple black dress, elegant rather than extravagant, her only jewelry a pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. Unlike many in the room, Elaine was not a regular fixture on the charity circuit. In fact, this was her first major appearance since moving back to New York after years abroad, working for international aid organizations. What few people in the room knew was that Elaine was the daughter of Hollywood legend Gene Hackman. The acclaimed actor had always kept his family life fiercely private, and Elaine had chosen a path that purposefully diverged from Hollywood glamour. She had built her own identity working in humanitarian relief, preferring to let her work speak for itself rather than her famous lineage. Tonight, she had come representing a small but impactful education initiative in rural communities, a cause far from the radar of most in attendance. As Elaine approached the donation table, she accidentally bumped into a waiter, causing him to spill a tray of champagne flutes. The crash of glass against marble created a sudden silence in the room, all eyes turning to the source of the disruption. "I'm so sorry," Elaine said immediately, bending down to help the flustered waiter. "Please, let me help you clean this up." It was this scene that caught Diana Whitcomb's attention, a woman in a simple dress, kneeling on the floor of the plaza, picking up broken glass while the elites looked on. Something about the woman's lack of embarrassment, her immediate willingness to get her hands dirty, ignited a spark of irritation in Diana. In her world, people like that, people who didn't know their place, were dangerous. They disrupted the natural order of things. "Well, well," Diana murmured to her circle of admirers. "It seems some people will do anything for attention when writing a check isn't an option." Her companions tittered appreciatively, always eager to align themselves with Diana's cutting observations. Encouraged, Diana glided across the room, her smile fixed in place as she approached the scene of the accident. The waiter had already scurried away to find a mop, leaving Elaine alone with a handful of broken glass. "You know, dear," Diana said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "the help really prefers to handle these situations themselves. It's what they're paid for, after all." Elaine looked up, momentarily startled by the interruption. "I was just trying to help," she said simply, rising to her feet. Diana's eyes narrowed slightly as she took in Elaine's appearance, the lack of designer labels, the minimal makeup, the sensible heels. "And you are?" she asked, though her tone made it clear that whoever this woman was, she was of little consequence. "Elaine Hackman," came the quiet reply. "I'm here representing the Global Education Initiative." "Hackman?" Diana repeated, a flicker of recognition crossing her features before being replaced by skepticism. "As in—" "Yes, Gene Hackman is my father," Elaine acknowledged, the slight stiffening of her shoulders the only indication that she was tired of this particular conversation. Diana's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How fascinating. I wasn't aware Gene had children who— What was it again? Global something, rather." Around them, a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by Diana's unmistakable tone of mockery. The room's atmosphere shifted, the air heavy with anticipation. Everyone knew Diana's reputation for public takedowns of those she deemed unworthy of her social circle. "We provide educational resources to underserved communities," Elaine explained, maintaining her composure. "Tonight, we're hoping to raise funds for—" "Oh, I'm sure you are," Diana interrupted, her voice dripping with condescension. "It must be so difficult, having to actually work for donations, rather than simply writing a check. Tell me, does Daddy not share his Hollywood millions? Or is this some sort of rich girl's attempt at finding meaning?" The room fell silent. Even by Diana's standards, this was a direct hit. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others leaned in, eager for the drama. No one moved to intervene. Diana Whitcomb's social power was absolute, and challenging her meant risking one's own standing. Elaine took a deep breath. In war zones and disaster areas, she had faced far worse than a privileged woman with a sharp tongue. But something about being publicly humiliated in her hometown, being dismissed as nothing more than Gene Hackman's daughter when she had spent years building her own identity, struck a nerve. Little did Diana know, her vicious attack wasn't just being witnessed by the usual society crowd. Across the room, a distinguished gentleman with steel-gray hair observed the scene with increasing displeasure, his hand tightening around his champagne glass. And in that moment, as Diana Whitcomb continued her tirade against the calm, composed Elaine Hackman, the wheels of karma began to turn. By the end of the night, Manhattan's Queen Bee would learn a lesson in humility that would reverberate through the social circles of New York for years to come. The stage was set, the players were in position, and Diana Whitcomb had no idea that her reign of social terror was about to face its most formidable challenge yet. Not from wealth or status, but from something far more powerful: the truth. The Plaza Hotel stood as a timeless monument to old New York wealth, its golden revolving doors having welcomed presidents, royalty, and celebrities for over a century. Tonight, the grand ballroom had been transformed into a breathtaking vision of opulence and excess. Crystal-encrusted centerpieces caught the light from vintage chandeliers, creating a constellation of sparkles across the room. The air was thick with the scent of white roses and jasmine, punctuated by occasional whiffs of exclusive perfumes that cost more than the average monthly rent in Manhattan. The Hope Foundation's annual gala wasn't just a charity event, it was a carefully orchestrated ballet of power, influence, and social hierarchy. The seating chart alone had taken weeks to finalize, with donors strategically placed according to the size of their contributions and their standing in New York society. The silent auction items, including a private dinner cooked by a Michelin-starred chef and a week at a private island in the Maldives, were displayed on illuminated pedestals, each with a starting bid that would make most people's heads spin. For Diana Whitcomb, this was home territory. She moved through the crowd like a shark through calm waters, elegant, purposeful, and instinctively feared. Her circle of influence parted and reformed around her as she made her calculated social rounds. Diana's position hadn't come easily, even with her family's banking fortune. Over 20 years, she had systematically eliminated rivals, cultivated allies, and cemented her status as the gatekeeper of Manhattan's high society. Her annual Diana's List, an exclusive compilation of approved stylists, caterers, and venues, could make or break businesses. Her endorsement of a charity could double its donations overnight, while her disfavor could empty an event faster than a fire alarm. "Impeccable event as always, Diana," said Carter Hammond, the silver-haired CEO of a pharmaceutical empire. "I hear your donations set a new record this year." Diana offered him the particular smile she reserved for potential allies. The Hope Foundation does such important work, Carter. Though between us, I do wish they would focus more on American issues rather than these international projects. Charity, like everything else, should begin at home. This subtle criticism wasn't lost on those within earshot. It was precisely aimed at initiatives like Elaine Hackman's, which focused on global education efforts rather than local causes. In Diana's carefully constructed worldview, the social value of philanthropy was measured less by its impact and more by its visibility within her circle. Across the room, Elaine Hackman stood by the Global Education Initiative's modest display table. Unlike the elaborate presentations of larger organizations, their setup consisted simply of a photo montage showing schools built in rural communities, along with before and after statistics on literacy rates. What the display lacked in glamour, it made up for in heart. Each image told a story of genuine transformation. Elaine had spent the past 7 years in the field, overseeing educational projects in regions recovering from natural disasters or conflict. Her hands, though manicured for tonight's event, usually bore the calluses and minor scars of someone who did real work rather than merely wrote checks. Her father's fame and fortune could have granted her an easy life of red carpets and trust funds, but Elaine had chosen a different path after witnessing the devastation of Hurricane Katrina during her college years. That experience had awakened something in her, a recognition of both her privilege and her responsibility. "Excuse me," said a deep voice beside her. "Are you with the Global Education Initiative?" Elaine turned to find an older gentleman studying the photos with genuine interest. His impeccably tailored tuxedo and the respect he commanded from passing waitstaff marked him as someone of importance, but his gaze held none of the dismissive gloss she'd encountered from others tonight. "Yes, I am," she replied with a warm smile. "I'm Elaine Hackman, the regional director." "Robert Winters," he introduced himself with a firm handshake. "I've been following your work in the Philippines after the typhoon. Remarkable results with limited resources." Elaine's eyes lit up at finding someone who actually knew about their projects. "We focus on sustainable models, training local teachers and building community-supported programs rather than just dropping in resources." As they continued their conversation, neither noticed Diana Whitcomb's calculating gaze from across the room. The sight of Robert Winters, one of New York's most respected philanthropists and the evening's honoree, engaged in deep conversation with the woman she had just publicly dismissed, sent a jolt of irritation through her perfectly maintained composure. "Who is that woman Robert's talking to?" Diana asked one of her allies, a plastic surgeon's wife, whose encyclopedic knowledge of New York society made her an invaluable asset. "Apparently, she's Gene Hackman's daughter," came the reply. "Works for some global charity. Not much of a presence in the city. I think she's been overseas for years." Diana's perfectly arched eyebrows rose slightly. "Gene Hackman? The actor? I thought his children were all in the industry." "Not this one. From what I hear, she's the black sheep, chose humanitarian work over Hollywood." This information only intensified Diana's irritation. In her world, celebrities and their offspring were valuable social currency, but only if they played by the established rules. A famous actor's daughter, who rejected wealth and glamour for do-gooder work abroad, was not just puzzling, she was almost offensive. Such choices implicitly criticized the very lifestyle Diana had spent decades perfecting. The event photographer approached, asking for a photo of Diana with the mayor. As she positioned herself for the shot, her smile diamond bright and practiced, she kept one eye on Elaine and Robert. Their conversation had extended beyond politeness into genuine engagement, with Robert now examining a folder of what appeared to be project proposals. Meanwhile, at a nearby table, a distinguished gentleman in his 80s observed the room with the measured patience of someone who had seen countless such events over the decades. His steel-gray hair and weathered face carried a quiet dignity, his presence commanding despite his age. Though he wore no designer labels, his tuxedo classic rather than trendy, several industry veterans had approached him with a deference rarely shown even to the wealthiest donors. Few people recognized him tonight, a fact that seemed to suit him perfectly well. The younger generation of socialites, including Diana Whitcomb, were too focused on current celebrities and influencers to identify a legend who had stepped away from the spotlight decades ago. But those with longer memories knew exactly who he was, and the significance of his rare appearance at a public event. As Diana finished her photo opportunity, she made her way toward Robert and Elaine, determined to redirect Robert's attention to more appropriate beneficiaries. Her approach was calculated, her smile practiced to perfection, as she prepared to reassert her control over the room's social dynamics. Little did she know that her path would soon cross with the elderly gentleman, setting in motion a chain of events that would permanently alter her carefully constructed social kingdom. The night was still young, the champagne still flowing, and Diana Whitcomb was about to learn that in the grand ballroom of life, karma sometimes arrives dressed in a vintage tuxedo, carrying decades of Hollywood wisdom and a father's protective instinct. Diana Whitcomb approached Elaine and Robert with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of the social interruption. Her diamond bracelet caught the light as she extended her hand toward Robert, effectively inserting herself between him and Elaine. "Robert, darling," she purred, air-kissing both his cheeks. "You've been hiding from me all evening. The mayor was just asking about your foundation's new initiative." Robert Winters offered a polite smile, though a flicker of annoyance crossed his features. "Diana, have you met Elaine Hackman? She's doing remarkable work with educational infrastructure in post-conflict zones." Diana turned toward Elaine, her smile never wavering, though her eyes cooled considerably. "Yes, we had a brief encounter earlier. Such interesting work you do, dear. Though I've always believed that charity begins at home, so many needs right here in our own backyard." Elaine maintained her composure, having encountered this particular brand of condescension many times before. "Actually, our organization operates on the principle that all children deserve quality education, regardless of where they happen to be born. Geographic boundaries shouldn't determine human value." Several nearby guests paused their conversations, sensing the subtle tension building between the two women. Diana's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "How charmingly idealistic," Diana replied, her voice honey-sweet but laced with venom. "Though, I suppose when one has a famous father to fall back on, one can afford such luxury ideals." The comment landed like a slap. Diana had deliberately targeted what she perceived as Elaine's vulnerability, her relationship to her famous father, attempting to diminish her accomplishments by attributing them to nepotism rather than merit. Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Diana, I've reviewed the Global Education Initiative's financials myself. They operate with exceptional efficiency, with over 90% of donations going directly to—" Of course, Diana interrupted smoothly. "I'm sure it's all very admirable, though one does wonder why we don't see more of the Hackman fortune supporting these efforts. Perhaps Daddy Dearest doesn't share the same passion for global causes?" The circle of listeners had grown, drawn by Diana's increasingly pointed remarks. This was what many secretly came to these events for, the social blood sport that Diana Whitcomb had elevated to an art form. Her targeted takedowns were legendary, and tonight's victim was proving more interesting than most. Elaine took a measured breath. "My father has always been generous, both publicly and privately, but I've chosen to build something on my own merits rather than rely solely on family connections." Diana's laugh was musical but sharp-edged. "How noble. Though, if you'll forgive my observation, your modest display suggests those merits haven't translated to significant funding. Perhaps with a more strategic approach, focusing on causes that appeal to actual donors in this room, you might find more success." The implication was clear. Elaine's work wasn't worthy of the elite crowd's attention or money. Diana was not merely criticizing her, she was effectively cutting her off from potential donors in the room. In the ecosystem of charity galas, such a move was the equivalent of a predator marking territory, a warning to others not to approach. "Our results speak for themselves," Elaine replied evenly. "We've helped establish sustainable educational systems in 12 communities across 3 continents. Our literacy rates have improved by an average of 68%. "Statistics are so impressive," Diana said with a dismissive wave. "But I've always found that real impact is about connection, knowing the right people, moving in the right circles. Unfortunately, spending years in, where was it again? Cambodia? Bangladesh? That sort of self-exile hardly builds the network necessary for serious philanthropy." Robert Winters cleared his throat. Diana, Tell me, Ms. Hackman, Diana continued, ignoring Robert's attempt to intervene. Does your father ever attend these events? Or does he find them beneath his Hollywood sensibilities? I've always wondered why some celebrities seem so reluctant to leverage their fame for actual good. The remark was deliberately provocative, questioning not only Elaine's standing but her father's character as well. Around them, several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Diana was going further than usual tonight, crossing the line from social alpha to outright bully. My father's charitable work is his own business, Elaine replied, her voice still steady, though a slight flush had risen to her cheeks, as is his choice to maintain his privacy. Diana's smile widened, sensing vulnerability. Privacy. How convenient, though one might interpret it as indifference. After all, if he truly supported your hobby, wouldn't he be here tonight? One appearance from Gene Hackman would certainly draw more attention to your cause than these charming but amateur photographs. She gestured dismissively toward the display of children in newly built classrooms, reducing years of life-changing work to a trivial pastime. Several of Diana's inner circle tittered appreciatively, following their leader's cue. Across the room, the elderly gentleman who had been observing the exchange straightened slightly, his weathered face hardening as he set down his champagne glass. I don't use my father's name to advance my work, Elaine said firmly. The Global Education Initiative stands on its own merits and methodology. How refreshingly principled, Diana replied, her voice dripping with mock admiration. Though principles don't build schools, do they? Money does. Connections do. Things you've apparently chosen to reject in favor of, what exactly? The satisfaction of struggling nobly? She turned to the gathered crowd. Isn't it fascinating how some people wear their self-sacrifice like a designer label? The comment drew uncomfortable laughter from some guests, while others shifted awkwardly, caught between social allegiance to Diana and discomfort with her increasingly pointed attack. Robert Winter's expression had darkened considerably. Diana, that's enough, he said quietly but firmly. Diana turned to him with wide, innocent eyes. Robert, darling, I'm simply having a conversation, getting to know Gene Hackman's daughter. After all, it's not every day we have Hollywood royalty among us, even if it's only by proxy. The emphasis on proxy was deliberate, another subtle dig suggesting Elaine had no value beyond her famous parentage. Diana reached out to touch Elaine's simple black dress, rubbing the fabric between her fingers as if assessing its quality. Though one would hardly know it, looking at this season before last Donna Karan. If you're going to reject Hollywood glamour, dear, at least invest in proper New York attire. I'd be happy to introduce you to my stylist. A little polish might help your fundraising efforts considerably. The physical invasion of space, coupled with the direct criticism of her appearance, was the most blatant show of disrespect yet. A hush fell over the immediate vicinity, the collective intake of breath almost audible. Diana Whitcomb had crossed from social sniping into public humiliation, violating even her own unspoken codes of conduct. In that charged moment of silence, the elderly gentleman began making his way through the crowd toward them, his movement unhurried but purposeful. Those who recognized him stepped aside immediately, whispers following in his wake, like ripples in still water. The elegant crowd parted like the Red Sea as the distinguished elderly gentleman made his deliberate approach. His weathered face carried the gravitas of decades in the public eye, though few of the younger socialites seemed to recognize him. Those who did, however, watched with wide eyes and hushed whispers, smartphones discreetly capturing what they instinctively knew would be a moment worth remembering. Diana, still savoring her perceived victory over Elaine, remained oblivious to the approaching figure. Her circle of sycophants continued to laugh appreciatively at her cutting remarks, each one emboldening her further. You know, Diana continued, her voice carrying just enough to ensure maximum audience, there's something almost quaint about your little project, like a college student's summer volunteer trip, but stretched into a career. At some point, one must ask whether you're helping others or simply avoiding real responsibility. Elaine maintained her composure, though the repeated barbs had begun to take their toll. Her hands, clasped before her, betrayed the slightest tremor, not from fear, but from the effort of restraining justified anger. Real responsibility, Elaine repeated quietly. Is that what you call this? spending fortunes on gowns and jewelry while critiquing those who choose different priorities? A collective intake of breath rippled through the onlookers. No one challenged Diana Whitcomb, not if they wanted to maintain their social standing in Manhattan. Diana's eyes narrowed dangerously. Careful, dear. Bitterness doesn't become you, though I suppose resentment is natural when one fails to live up to a famous parent's legacy. Your father created art that touched millions. You build, what, shacks with chalkboards in countries most people here couldn't locate on a map. It was at this precise moment that the elderly gentleman stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a perfectly honed blade. I'd say she's exceeded my legacy considerably, Ms. Whitcomb. The voice, that unmistakable, gravelly baritone familiar to moviegoers for over 5 decades, caused Diana to freeze mid-gesture. Slowly, almost comically, she turned to find herself face to face with Gene Hackman himself, the legendary actor whose career had earned him 2 Academy Awards and a place in Hollywood history. Mr. Hackman, she stammered, her perfectly composed facade cracking for the first time that evening. What a surprise. We had no idea you would honor us with your presence tonight. Gene Hackman's expression remained impassive, though his eyes, the same intense gaze that had intimidated countless on-screen adversaries, fixed on Diana with unmistakable disapproval. Clearly, he replied dryly. Otherwise, you might have thought twice before disparaging my daughter's life's work. The room had fallen into complete silence now, the usual background hum of conversation extinguished by the drama unfolding before them. Even the waitstaff had paused, trays of champagne suspended mid-circuit. I assure you, Mr. Hackman, Diana attempted to recover, summoning her most ingratiating smile. I was merely engaging in friendly conversation. Your daughter's work is fascinating. Is that so? Gene replied, his tone making it clear he wasn't buying her sudden change of heart. Because, from where I was standing, it sounded like you were questioning both her achievements and my support of them. He turned toward Elaine, his stern expression softening immediately. Sorry I'm late, sweetheart. Traffic was a nightmare. Elaine's surprise melted into a warm smile as her father embraced her. You didn't have to come, Dad. I know how you feel about these events. I miss seeing you in action? Not a chance, he replied, his pride evident. Then, addressing the stunned onlookers, he continued with the commanding presence that had made him a screen legend. For those who don't know, my daughter has refused any financial assistance from me since she graduated college. Everything she's built, she's done on her own merit, through her own determination. Diana's complexion had paled considerably beneath her perfect makeup, the social catastrophe unfolding before her, rendering her temporarily speechless. Gene Hackman, notoriously private, rarely seen at public events, had emerged from seclusion not to promote himself, but to defend his daughter against precisely the kind of elitist snobbery he had avoided throughout his career. Robert Winters stepped forward, seizing the moment. Gene, it's an honor. I was just telling Elaine how impressed I am with the Global Education Initiative's work. In fact, I was about to discuss a potential matching grant from my foundation. Gene nodded appreciatively. She wouldn't take my money, but I hope she'll take yours, Robert. Those schools are changing lives. The results speak for themselves, Robert agreed. 90% of their graduates go on to secondary education, compared to less than 20% before their programs were implemented. Other guests, sensing the dramatic shift in social winds, began to gather around Elaine's previously ignored display. Smartphones appeared as people photographed the images of smiling children in classrooms, tagging them with supportive messages about the cause, and, not incidentally, documenting their proximity to Gene Hackman for their social media followers. Diana Whitcomb stood frozen, watching her social capital evaporate in real time. Then, in a desperate bid to salvage her position, she stepped forward with a brittle smile. Mr. Hackman, you must be so proud. Perhaps you'd like to join me in making a donation to Elaine's cause. I'd be happy to write a check right now for, shall we say, $50,000? The transparent attempt at damage control drew a knowing look from Gene. That's generous, Ms. Whitcomb, though I'm curious whether you'd have made the same offer before you knew who I was. Diana's smile remained fixed, though her eyes betrayed her panic. Gene studied her for a moment, then continued in the measured tone that had delivered countless memorable lines. You know, in 50 years of making movies, I've played all kinds of characters, heroes, villains, and everything in between. But the one thing I've learned is that a person's true character isn't revealed by who they flatter, but by how they treat those they think can't help them. The pointed observation hung in the air, a public rebuke delivered with the perfect timing of a master actor. Around them, several guests nodded in agreement, a few even stepping away from Diana as if her social toxicity might be contagious. Elaine, ever gracious, attempted to ease the tension. "We appreciate all support for our cause, regardless of the motivation. Every contribution helps another child access education." Gene smiled at his daughter with obvious pride. "And that, Ms. Whitcomb, is the difference between genuine class and the kind that's just for show." By now, reporters who had been covering the gala had caught wind of Gene Hackman's surprise appearance and were making their way toward the scene. Diana, recognizing that the night had turned into a public relations disaster for her carefully cultivated image, retreated with as much dignity as she could muster. As the evening continued, Elaine's display table became the unexpected center of attention, with genuine interest and substantial donations flowing in from guests who had previously overlooked it. Robert Winters publicly announced a $1 million matching grant, challenging others to support the cause. Gene Hackman remained by his daughter's side, not as a celebrity draw, but as a proud father, letting Elaine's work and vision take center stage. Diana Whitcomb departed early, citing a sudden migraine. By morning, her social media accounts would be filled with photographs of the event, none featuring her, but many showcasing Gene Hackman, his daughter, and their worthy cause. The story of how Manhattan's social queen had been dethroned, if only for one night, by the quiet dignity of a father-daughter reunion, would ripple through New York society for months to come. True power, it seemed, didn't reside in designer gowns or cutting remarks, but in authentic purpose, and occasionally in the perfectly timed appearance of a Hollywood legend who knew exactly when to deliver his most important role, that of a proud father.